Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot returned with his tribe. The wind screamed across the valley that night. Inside his small cabin, Samuel Smith heard it 3 heavy knocks against the door. No one should be out there, not in a storm like this. Lantern in hand, he stepped into the snow. Huge footprints led to the barn, wide, bare, and human-like. Then he saw it. A shadow as tall as the barn door standing silent in the rain. Samuel didn't raise his axe. He opened the barn, laid down hay and an old wool blanket. "If you need shelter," he said softly, "stay." By dawn, the storm was gone. On the porch, a small circle of stones waited, a quiet thank you from the forest itself. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. It was the winter of 1897 in a forgotten valley of the American West. The storm came without warning, a roaring wall of wind and snow that swallowed the mountains whole. Inside a small cabin, a single lamp flickered its light, trembling across the rough wooden walls. Samuel Smith, a rancher long past his prime, stood by the fire, splitting logs to keep the room alive with warmth. Outside, the world screamed. The wind howled through the pines like 1,000 ghosts, and the roof groaned under the weight of ice. Then 3 heavy knocks, slow, deliberate. They came from the barn door. Samuel froze. Scout, his old dog, rose from the floor, ears pinned back, a low whimper escaping his throat. Samuel took the lantern and stepped into the storm. Snow cut against his face like shards of glass. The night glowed pale, the valley buried beneath white silence. And there, beneath the flicker of his light, he saw them. Footprints, wide as 2 hands, sunk deep in the snow. Not hooves, not boots. Bare, human-shaped, 18 inches long. A shadow moved at the edge of the barn, tall as the door itself, broad-shouldered, still as stone. Rain ran down its dark form. 2 deep eyes caught the lantern's glow. Samuel's breath trembled, but instead of raising his axe, he opened the barn door wide, set the lantern down, and whispered, "If you need shelter, stay." The wind swallowed his words, and as the door swung shut behind him, the valley fell quiet once more. Part 1. The Man Who Stopped Talking. Morning came pale and uncertain. The storm had passed, leaving behind a valley wrapped in silence, white, endless, and still. Smoke rose thin from the chimney of a small log cabin tucked between the frozen pines. Inside, the fire whispered low, its glow crawling across the floorboards like sunlight through dust. Samuel Smith sat beside it, his elbows resting on his knees, a folded map spread open across the small wooden table. The map was yellowed and frayed, edges curled like old bark. He traced the lines with a calloused finger, rivers, mountains, forgotten trails. None of it mattered anymore. The world outside those lines had already moved on without him. He had once dreamed of marking this map with color red ink for rivers he'd cross, blue for valleys he'd claim. But that was a lifetime ago. Now it was just paper, just memory. Scout, his aging dog, stirred near the hearth, stretching, then curling back into a circle of warmth. Samuel glanced down and managed a quiet smile. Outside, the snow was blinding, perfect, untouched. Inside, everything was slow, deliberate, heavy. The narrator's voice would have spoken soft, low, like the wind through dry grass. Samuel Smith was 68 years old. He had worked this land since he was a boy, and when the world stopped needing him, he stayed anyway. Samuel rose, poured himself a tin cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. It had gone cold hours ago, but he drank it without a thought. He looked toward the wall above the table. An old photograph hung there, barely catching the morning light. A woman with kind eyes and a shawl around her shoulders. Anna. He stood still for a long while, staring at her face as if she might move or speak or simply breathe again. She'd been gone 12 years now. No children, no family, only the land, the animals, and the seasons that never cared whether a man lived or died beneath their sky. Sometimes when the wind shifted through the valley just right, Samuel thought he heard her voice, not words, just a hum like the song she used to hum while hanging laundry on the line. But it was only the wind, It was always the wind. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tarnished ring. Her wedding band. He turned it in his fingers, the metal dull and worn from years of being carried in silence. Still fits, he muttered under his breath, though it didn't. His hands had grown too rough, too large. He set it down on the table beside his map next to a small wooden box filled with old Nail's fishing hooks and memories that no longer hurt as much as they used to. By mid-morning, the light crept through the cracks in the shutters, thin and uncertain. Samuel pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The air bit his face clean and sharp. The valley stretched wide before him, quiet, except for the groan of the old barn settling under the snow. He crossed the yard slowly, boots sinking deep into the white crust. The world was colorless gray sky, white ground, black timber. Only the faint curl of smoke from his chimney reminded him that fire still existed somewhere. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the cattle shifted, snorted their breath, fogging the air. He checked their feed, rubbed frost from a pail of water, adjusted a broken hinge. The rhythm of his work was as steady as the ticking of a clock feed fix mend repeat. He used to talk while he worked to Anna, to the horses, sometimes even to the wind. But not anymore. The words had run out long ago, scattered like dust. Now there was only the sound of his breath, the scrape of tools, the quiet groan of wood. When he came back inside, he hung his coat by the door and poured another cup of coffee, this time hot, fresh, and bitter. Scout lifted his head tail, wagging lazily. Samuel knelt beside him, rubbing the dog's ear. "Guess it's just us, old boy," he said softly. "Always was." Scout licked his hand, the simple warmth of it almost enough to undo him. Samuel sat back down near the stove, pulled the photograph of Anna from the wall, and set it on the table in front of him. He studied it for a long time. The corners were cracked. The image faded, but her eyes, they still held that calm, gentle look that had steadied him once. He remembered how she'd make him talk even when he didn't want to, how she'd laugh when he pretended not to care. He missed that sound more than anything. "Ain't much left worth talking to," he whispered, voice catching like dry wood under pressure. The fire popped. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a low, hollow echo down from the ridge like a door closing far away. Samuel didn't move. He just stared into the flames, the light flickering across his lined face, the quiet carving itself deeper into his bones. As the day faded, the sky turned pale gold above the ridge. The storm clouds had broken apart, drifting east. Samuel stepped out once more before dusk, lantern in hand, and stood by the porch railing. The valley looked peaceful now, wrapped in snow and silence, as if the storm had never come at all. But somewhere beyond the tree line, something had changed. The air felt different, alive, aware. Scout sat beside him watching the woods. His ears twitched, then stilled. Samuel sighed and whispered almost to himself, "You ever wonder if the forest remembers us, Scout, or if it just watches and waits for us to be gone?" The dog didn't move, didn't answer, only breathed slow and steady. Samuel smiled faintly, turned and walked back inside. The door shut behind him with a soft thud. The last light of day bled away from the window. Inside only the fire remained, and a man who had long since stopped talking yet still listened for something he couldn't name. Part 2, The Signs in the Woods. The days that followed were quieter than usual, too quiet. Even for a valley used to silence, something had changed. By the second morning, Samuel noticed it first in the air, a stillness that felt like breath being held. The birds that normally perched on the fence posts were gone. The rabbits that used to dart through the brush had vanished. Even the wind, when it came, carried a different sound, not the rush of air through pines, but a low murmur like whispers weaving between the trees. Scout paced the porch, nose-lifted, ears twitching at nothing Samuel could see. The dog would stop growl once, then sit down again, confused. Samuel watched the tree line for a long while. He'd lived on this land 35 years and knew its moods better than he knew his own reflection. But now the woods were looking back. That afternoon, while mending the north fence, he saw it. At first, he thought it was just storm damage. Snow drifted deep against the posts, one rail snapped loose. But then he looked closer. The post hadn't broken. It had been lifted, pulled straight up from the frozen ground, the earth packed tight around the hole. No splinters, no axe marks, just clean strength. And beside the hole, pressed deep into the wet earth, was the shape of a hand. 5 thick fingers spread wide, the size of a dinner plate. Samuel froze. The wind cut across his coat, but he didn't move. He crouched, placing his palm inside the mark. It swallowed his whole hand and half his wrist. Not a bear, he whispered. Not a man, either. Scout barked once sharp, then went silent, tail tucked. Samuel stood there a while, eyes scanning the trees, but the woods offered no answers, only that strange whispering wind. That night, the first sound came just after midnight. Knock, knock. 2 dull strikes far away, deep among the trees. Then silence. A few moments later, knock, knock again, slower, rhythmic, deliberate. Samuel sat up in bed, heart heavy in his chest. He knew the noises of this valley, the crack of ice, the shifting of branches, the moan of wind through timber. This was none of those. This was intention. He reached for the lantern and lit it. The flame trembled in the glass as he listened. Scout stood by the door, fur-bristling eyes locked on the dark outside. The knocking came again, farther this time, then stopped altogether. For an hour, Samuel sat awake, waiting for it to return. It didn't. Only the fire whispered in the stove, and the sound of his own breath filled the cabin. When dawn came, the world looked normal again. White snow, gray sky, nothing out of place. But the quiet wasn't the same. It wasn't peace. It was waiting. On the 3rd night, the wind died entirely. The valley lay under a sheet of silver frost, moonlight glinting off the barn roof. Samuel was fixing a broken broom by the door when Scout suddenly barked one sharp, startled sound and bolted to the window. Outside, the barn door swayed open just a few inches, creaking softly. Samuel frowned. He was sure he'd latched it after feeding the horses. Lantern in hand, he crossed the yard. Each step crunched loud in the frost. He pushed the door wider and held the light high. The barn was empty. The animals were calm, their breath hanging in thin clouds. Nothing moved. Then he saw it leaning against the wall near the tool rack. His broom, the one he had snapped the handle of 2 days ago, now stood whole again. The pieces had been tied together with a strip of woven vine, tight, neat, strong. Samuel stared at it for a long moment, unable to speak. Whoever, whatever had done it, hadn't taken or broken anything. It had fixed it. He felt his throat tighten, a strange mix of fear and gratitude. Slowly he set the lantern on a beam, crouched beside the broom, and touched the vine. It was still damp, freshly cut, the work of careful hands. Scout stood beside him, quiet now, tail wagging, once uncertain but not afraid. Samuel whispered more to himself than anyone else. Whatever it is, it means no harm. He left the broom where it was closed, the barn door gently, and looked up at the ridge. The moonlight glowed soft over the snow, silvering the tops of the pines. For the first time in years, the valley didn't feel empty. Something unseen was moving through it, not to frighten, not to harm, but to share the space. He walked back toward the cabin, his breath rising in clouds before him. Scout followed close steps, silent. When they reached the porch, Samuel turned once more toward the trees. The forest stood quiet, patient, alive. He whispered into the wind, "You can stay, if you're out there." The wind answered with a faint sigh, almost like a voice saying, "Thank you." Inside, the fire crackled, and for the first time in years, Samuel felt the smallest warmth that didn't come from wood or flame, the warmth of presence. He didn't know what it was that lived in those woods, but he knew this much: he was no longer alone. Part 3. The Visitor's Return. The second storm came harder than the first. By nightfall, the sky had vanished behind a curtain of black cloud, and the wind screamed down the valley like it meant to tear the world apart. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to snow. The cabin shook with every gust. Inside, Samuel fed the fire and checked the latch on the door twice. Scout lay near the stove, restless, his tail thumping the floorboards without reason. It had been quiet for days, no more knocks, no more strange signs in the woods. But the air tonight felt heavy, charged like a storm, made not just of weather but of something waiting. Then through the roar of wind came a sound deep low, almost drowned by the storm, a groan, then another, and beneath the thunder, faint but clear, the soft cry of pain. Samuel turned toward the window. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat the world outside blazed white. In that single flash, he saw them, shapes, tall, hulking figures moving through the snow. 3, no 4 of them crossing the pasture toward the barn. One of them stumbled, half carried by the others. The light died. Darkness returned. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. Scout whined low, not barking, not growling, just trembling. For a moment, Samuel stood frozen, hand hovering near his axe. Then he reached for the lantern instead. "Stay, boy," he said softly. "Stay." He opened the door and the wind hit him like a fist. Snow blew sideways, stinging his face. He raised the lantern high and stepped off the porch boots, sinking into the slush. The barn loomed ahead, dim in the swirling storm. Between flashes of lightning, he caught glimpses, massive forms hunched against the wind, moving slow, deliberate. As he neared, one turned toward him. Its eyes shone gold in the lamplight, wide, wary, human, in a way that made his stomach twist. There were 5 of them this time, and one smaller was hurt. It lay half-curled in the snow, its fur matted dark along the ribs. Steam rose from the wound where blood met cold air. The others gathered close, protective, their breath misting in the storm. Samuel stopped a few yards away, the lantern flickering in his hand. He wanted to run. Every instinct in him screamed that this was madness, wild, unnatural. But then the smallest of the creatures lifted its head, meeting his gaze. Its eyes were full of pain, not wildness, not anger, but something he understood all too well: fear. The largest of the group stepped aside as if giving him space, lowering its massive head in a slow, deliberate motion. Samuel's breath caught. It was an invitation. He stepped closer. Slowly. The snow crunched beneath his boots. When he knelt beside the wounded creature, the others didn't move. The fur was soaked, the skin beneath torn deep by claws, cougar maybe, or bear. He couldn't tell. The small one whimpered as he touched its side. Samuel spoke softly, the same way he'd once spoken to a frightened horse. "It's all right," he murmured. "You'll be all right." He set the lantern down, pulled off his coat, and pressed it against the wound. Warm blood seeped through the fabric, hot against his cold hands. Scout barked once from the porch, sharp and uncertain. Samuel looked up and called, "Quiet, boy." The dog obeyed, but didn't move. He turned back to the group. The largest creature, he thought it must be the mother, watched him closely. Her shoulders were broad as a doorframe, her breath heavy, her eyes gleaming under the stormlight. When Samuel met her gaze, she lowered her head again. Something passed between them, wordless, ancient, an understanding. He stood, took a step back, then motioned toward the barn. "Come," he said, pointing. "It's dry. It's safe." The mother hesitated, then lifted the wounded one into her arms gently, impossibly careful for something so large. Together, the group moved toward the barn, stooping to fit through the door. Samuel followed behind, lantern held high. Inside, the warmth hit him like a sigh. The animals stirred but didn't panic, only watched, curious, quiet. Samuel laid down a blanket in the far corner, fetched a bucket of water from the trough, and poured it slow. He found the old wool quilt Anna had sewn decades ago, patched, faded, but still soft, and spread it beside the straw. The wounded one was laid there. The others stood in a circle, silent, watching him work. Samuel's hands trembled as he wrung out a cloth and cleaned the wound. Blood stained the water dark, but the creature didn't fight or flinch, only breathed, steady and deep. The mother knelt beside her child, her massive hand hovering near Samuel's shoulder. He froze, but she didn't touch him. She only bowed her head, eyes soft, as if to say thank you. For a long time, the only sounds were the patter of rain on the roof and the slow rhythm of their breathing. When the storm finally eased, Samuel stood in the doorway, lantern still burning low. The barn glowed warm behind him. Outside, the valley shimmered under a fresh coat of snow. He looked toward the fence line, and his breath caught again. Where the rail had been broken days before, it now stood whole, repaired, not with nails or boards, but woven branches, pine and willow, thick and tight like a basket. He stared at it, silent rain running down his face. "Guess we're even now," he whispered. Then he turned back toward the barn. The mother was watching from the shadows, her child asleep at her side. For a moment, Samuel thought he saw something almost like a smile in her eyes. He nodded once, then pulled the door closed to keep out the wind. Outside, the storm faded into silence, and for the first time in years, Samuel Smith didn't feel like the last soul left in the valley. Part 4, The Long Night. The storm had passed, but the night was not quiet. It was the kind of silence that hums alive, heavy, full of breath. Samuel sat by the stove, staring into the flames. The fire popped and cracked, shadows moving across the cabin walls like ghosts trying to find their way home. Outside, the rain had thinned to a slow, patient drip from the roof. He could hear the barn creak softly with the wind, and beneath that, something else. A deep, steady breathing. Heavy labored. The sound of life struggling through pain. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together like a man in prayer. Scout lay curled near the hearth eyes, half-open head resting on his paws. Every now and then the dog's ears twitched toward the barn. Samuel whispered, "You hear it too, don't you, boy?" Scout didn't move, but his tail thumped once against the floor, slow, reassuring. Samuel reached for the kettle on the stove, poured himself a cup of water, and just sat there, holding it in both hands. He stared at the steam curling upward, disappearing into the rafters the way a memory does when you stop chasing it. He hadn't thought about that night in years, the night Anna died. It had come fast like this storm-cold rain, bad roads, and a fever that burned through her before the doctor could even reach them. He'd done everything he could, kept her warm, prayed, begged. But he couldn't save her. He remembered holding her hand until it went still, the last warmth leaving her skin. For a long time after that, Samuel stopped believing he could save anything. Cattle fences, trees, they all died or fell apart in their time. And he let them. He'd convinced himself that was the way of things. But tonight, listening to the breathing from the barn, he felt that old ache again. That question that never quite left him. Maybe he wasn't meant to stop death, but maybe he was still meant to try. He whispered into the quiet, "Maybe I can still save something." He rose from his chair, took his lantern, and opened the cabin door. The cold met him like a sigh. Rain whispered across the roof as he crossed the yard. Each step sank soft into the damp earth. When he reached the barn, he paused at the door. The glow from inside was dim, just the faint shimmer of moonlight slipping through the cracks in the boards. He pushed the door open slowly. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of hay and animal breath. The big ones were resting their massive shapes like dark hills in the corner. The injured one lay near the blankets, breathing heavy but steady. Samuel stepped closer, lantern low. The young Bigfoot's fur was still matted with blood, but the wound had stopped seeping. He knelt beside it, touching the cloth he'd tied earlier. It was soaked through. He took out a clean strip of fabric, dipped it in the bucket of warm water he'd brought, and began to clean the wound again. His hands were rough but gentle. He worked in silence, only the sound of water and the slow rise and fall of the creature's chest between them. The others stirred slightly but didn't move. And then from the shadows the mother rose. She was enormous, her head brushing the rafters. Her eyes caught the lantern light, deep amber, reflecting not threat but watchfulness. Samuel froze. His heart pounded in his ears. He didn't move, didn't speak. The mother took one step forward, then knelt beside him, slow, cautious. She didn't touch him, only looked at the wound, then at his hands, and finally at his face. There was a long moment where time didn't exist, only the sound of rain on the roof, and two different kinds of breathing, human and not, but somehow the same. Samuel nodded slightly as if to say, "It's all right." The mother exhaled through her nose, a soft, low sound that almost felt like a sigh. He finished tying the clean bandage, then laid the wool blanket over the young one's shoulders. The creature stirred, murmured weakly, and then went still again. Samuel sat back on his heels, wiped his hands on his coat, and looked up at the mother. She was watching him with a stillness that could have belonged to a mountain. He didn't know what she saw, a threat, a savior, or just another creature doing what he could to keep the dark away for one more night. But in her gaze, something changed. It was trust. Pure, simple, wordless trust. He sat there longer than he realized, lantern burning low beside him. He reached out once, hesitantly, and laid his hand against the young one's chest. Under the fur, he felt the slow, strong rhythm of its heartbeat. It was powerful, alive, the steady drum of something wild and eternal. For a moment, Samuel closed his eyes. The sound of that heart became the sound of another faint fading from years ago, the last heartbeat he'd felt before Anna slipped away. Tears burned behind his eyes. This time, though, the heart under his hand kept beating. He exhaled shakily and whispered, "Good, good." The mother watched him, and in the dim light he thought he saw her eyes soften wet at the edges, reflecting the same grief and relief he felt inside. He nodded once more, not as a man to a beast, but as one survivor to another. Hours passed. The storm eased into drizzle. One by one, the creatures drifted into sleep. Samuel stayed by the lantern until its flame thinned and trembled. He rose finally, joints stiff, back aching, and looked around the barn. For the first time in years it felt alive again, not just with animals or tools, but with something that had weight, warmth, meaning. He turned to go whispering into the dark, "Rest easy now. You're safe here." As he reached the door, he looked back one last time. The mother's eyes were still on him, steady, grateful. He didn't need words. He just nodded. She nodded back. Outside, the rain had stopped. The valley glowed faintly in moonlight, the snow melting into quiet pools. Samuel walked back to the cabin, lantern in hand. The fire inside was dying, but he didn't mind. He sat down, boots still wet, and for the first time in years, he felt something settle inside his chest. Not grief, not fear, but peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Part 5. The Gift of Silence. The storm never came back. 2 days passed beneath skies that softened from gray to silver, and then finally to gold. The snow began to melt in slow streams down the valley, trickling beneath fences and soaking into the thirsty earth. The forest, once heavy with fear, now breathed again quietly like something waking from a long sleep. On the morning of the second day, Samuel woke to sunlight spilling across the floorboards. It had been so long since light had entered this cabin without being filtered through storm or shadow. He lay still for a moment, listening. No wind, no thunder. Just the calm creak of the wood and the slow, steady breathing of Scout at his feet. The quiet was different now. Not hollow, not lonely. It was full. He rose, put on his coat, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, but gentle, touched with the scent of wet pine. The valley stretched before him white, giving way to brown frost, giving way to mud. He looked toward the barn, the roof gleaming with morning dew. Something in his chest tightened. He knew before he even reached it. They were gone. The door hung open, swinging lightly in the breeze. Inside, the straw was pressed flat where the great bodies had lain. The wool blanket he'd left was folded neatly by the wall as if returned. The bucket of water stood empty, the edges polished clean. No footprints, no fur. Only the faint warmth in the air, the kind that lingers a while after a fire's gone out. Samuel stood in the doorway for a long time, hands at his sides. He didn't feel abandoned, only changed. The kind of quiet that followed wasn't the same quiet that had haunted him for 12 long years. He turned back toward the cabin. Scout trotted ahead, tail wagging, slow nose pressed to the ground. Halfway across the yard, the dog stopped. Samuel followed his gaze, and then he saw it. On the flat stone step of the porch sat a small circle of river rocks, each one smoothed and gray-stacked 3 layers high. Perfect. Deliberate. Beside it lay a small branch of pine woven into a shape, something between a loop and a knot, simple but meaningful. He crouched, slowly, breath catching in his throat. He touched one of the stones. It was cold from the morning air, but it felt alive somehow, as though holding warmth from another hand. A gift. He didn't need to understand the words of it. He already knew. They just needed a roof, he said softly. Voice rough, but steady. Same as me. The wind brushed through the pines, then gentle, almost playful, like an answer. He sat there on the porch step for a long time. Scout pressed close beside him. The dog laid his head on Samuel's knee, eyes half-closed, tail sweeping softly against the floor. Across the valley, the sunlight broke fully through the clouds. The snow on the ridge gleamed like silver glass. For the first time in a long time, Samuel smiled without the weight of loneliness pressing behind it. He looked toward the woods, those deep, endless shadows where he'd once seen only danger and isolation. Now he saw something else: connection. The broken fence, the fixed broom, the quiet nights when the knocking never came again because there was no need to ask permission. They had been careful, gentle, respectful, just as he had. And somehow in that fragile peace, both man and creature had found what they needed most. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Samuel carried his coffee to the porch and sat again. The stones glowed faintly in the light. He reached out, turning one between his fingers, watching how the morning caught the smooth, gray surface. Scout lifted his head, watching him. Samuel chuckled quietly. "Guess we've got neighbors after all," he said. "Just the quiet kind." The dog wagged his tail once as if in agreement, then laid his head back down. Samuel leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed, and listened. To the wind through the trees, to the creek thawing beneath the hill, to the faint rhythm of a world that somehow had forgiven him. The silence around him wasn't empty. It was a gift. That evening before the sun dropped, he walked back to the barn one last time. He lit the lantern and hung it by the door the same way he had the night they'd come to him through the storm. It swung gently in the dusk, its glow soft against the darkening snow. He whispered, "If you ever need shelter again." The door's still open. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin. The air was calm, the sky deep blue, fading to gold. Behind him, the lantern flame flickered once bright before settling into a steady burn. When night came, Samuel sat by the stovepen in hand. He took an old scrap of paper from the drawer and began to write, not for anyone else to read, but just to remember. He wrote about the storm, about the tracks, about the eyes that weren't human, but weren't cruel either. And he wrote about the silence that had changed everything. He stopped staring at the final line, unsure how to end it. Then he smiled faintly and whispered it aloud as if Anna might hear him somewhere in the quiet. They weren't monsters, just forest folk, quiet, careful. They needed a roof. I had one. That was all. He folded the note, set it by the lamp, and leaned back in his chair. Scout was already asleep, the fire low but steady. Outside, the valley was still peaceful, forgiving, and for the first time in years, Samuel Smith didn't feel like a man waiting for life to end. He felt like a man who had lived enough to begin again. Years passed like drifting snow. The valley grew quiet again, softer now, older like the man who still called it home. Samuel Smith sat on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, the evening light warm against his weathered hands. Scout, now gray around the muzzle, lay beside his chair, half asleep. The narrator's voice came low and steady, carried on the breath of dusk. Every fall before the first frost, I lay out a blanket, a bucket of water, and a light on the porch. Some years they came, some years they didn't, but every winter the firewood never ran low. Samuel smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the tree line where the forest met the fading sun. Mist rolled through the pines, quiet as memory. Then a single knock echoed from the woods. He didn't turn his head. He just whispered, soft as a prayer, "Welcome home." The wind answered with silence, the kind that means peace, not emptiness. Because in the cold West, kindness is the only fire that never dies. If this story touched your heart, leave a fire emoji below so we'll know the kindness in you is still burning. This is Rancher Wild West Stories, where Western cinema legend and healing meet beneath one sky.